Stokely Carmichael, born June 29, 1941, Port of Spain, Trinidad, died November 15, 1998, Conakry, Guinea, was a West Indian-born civil rights activist, leader of black nationalism in the United States in the 1960s and originator of its rallying slogan, Black Power. Carmichael immigrated to New York City in 1952, attended high school in the Bronx, and enrolled at Howard University in 1960. There he joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee (SNCC) and the Nonviolent Action Group. In 1961, Carmichael was one of several freedom riders who traveled through the South challenging segregation laws in interstate transportation. For his participation, he was arrested and jailed for about 50 days in Jackson, Mississippi. Carmichael continued his involvement with the civil rights movement and SNCC after his graduation with honors from Howard University in 1964. That summer he joined SNCC in Lowndes County, Alabama, for an African American voter registration drive and helped to organize the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, an independent political party. A Black Panther was chosen as the party's emblem, a powerful image later adopted in homage by the Black Panther Party. During this period, Carmichael and others associated with SNCC supported the nonviolence approach to desegregation espoused by Martin Luther King Jr., but Carmichael was becoming increasingly frustrated, having witnessed beatings and murders of several civil rights activists. In 1966 he became the chairman of SNCC, and during a march in Mississippi he rallied demonstrators in founding the Black Power movement, which espoused self-defense tactics, self-determination, political and economic power, and racial pride. This controversial split from King's ideology of nonviolence and racial integration was seen by moderate blacks as detrimental to the civil rights cause and was viewed with apprehension by many whites. Before leaving SNCC in 1968, Carmichael traveled abroad speaking out against political and economic repression and denouncing U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Upon his return, Carmichael's passport was confiscated and held for 10 months. He left the United States in 1969 and moved with his first wife, 1968-79, South African singer Miriam Makeba, to Guinea, West Africa. He also changed his name to Kwame Ture in honor of two early proponents of Pan-Africanism, Ghanaian Kwame Nkrumah and Guinean Sekou Touré. Carmichael helped to establish the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, an international political party dedicated to Pan-Africanism and the plight of Africans worldwide. In 1971 he wrote Stokely Speaks, Black Power Back to Pan-Africanism. American Civil Rights Movement, mass protest movement against racial segregation and discrimination in the southern United States that came to national prominence during the mid-1950s. This movement had its roots in the centuries-long efforts of enslaved Africans and their descendants to resist racial oppression and abolish the institution of slavery. Although enslaved people were emancipated as a result of the American Civil War and were then granted basic civil rights through the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, struggles to secure federal protection of these rights continued during the next century. Through nonviolent protest, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s broke the pattern of public facilities being segregated by race in the South and achieved the most important breakthrough in equal rights legislation for African Americans since the Reconstruction period 1865-77. Although the passage in 1964 and 1965 of major civil rights legislation was victorious for the movement, by then militant black activists had begun to see their struggle as a freedom or liberation movement not just seeking civil rights reforms but instead confronting the enduring economic, political, and cultural consequences of past racial oppression. American history has been marked by persistent and determined efforts to expand the scope and inclusiveness of civil rights. Although equal rights for all were affirmed in the founding documents of the United States, many of the new country's inhabitants were denied essential rights. Enslaved Africans and indentured servants did not have the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that British colonists asserted to justify their Declaration of Independence. Nor were they included among the people of the United States, who established the Constitution in order to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Instead, the Constitution protected slavery by allowing the importation of enslaved persons until 1808 and providing for the return of enslaved people who had escaped to other states. As the United States expanded its boundaries, Native American peoples resisted conquest and absorption. Individual states, which determined most of the rights of American citizens, generally limited voting rights to white property-owning males, and other rights, such as the right to own land or serve on juries, were often denied on the basis of racial or gender distinctions. A small proportion of black Americans lived outside the slave system, but those so-called free blacks endured racial discrimination and enforced segregation. Although some enslaved persons violently rebelled against their enslavement, see slave rebellions, African Americans and other subordinated groups mainly used nonviolent means. Protests, legal challenges, pleas and petitions addressed to government officials, as well as sustained and massive civil rights movements, to achieve gradual improvements in their status. During the first half of the 19th century, movements to extend voting rights to non-property-owning white male laborers resulted in the elimination of most property qualifications for voting, but this expansion of suffrage was accompanied by brutal suppression of American Indians and increasing restrictions on free blacks. Owners of enslaved people in the South reacted to the 1831 Nat Turner slave revolt in Virginia by passing laws to discourage anti-slavery activism and prevent the teaching of enslaved people to read and write. Despite this repression, a growing number of black Americans freed themselves from slavery by escaping or negotiating agreements to purchase their freedom through wage labor. By the 1830s, free black communities in the northern states had become sufficiently large and organized to hold regular national conventions, where black leaders gathered to discuss alternative strategies of racial advancement. In 1833, a small minority of whites joined with black anti-slavery activists to form the American Anti-Slavery Society under the leadership of William Lloyd Garrison. Frederick Douglass became the most famous of the formerly enslaved persons who joined the abolition movement. His autobiography, one of many slave narratives, and his stirring orations heightened public awareness of the horrors of slavery. Although black leaders became increasingly militant in their attacks against slavery and other forms of racial oppression, their efforts to secure equal rights received a major setback in 1857, when the U.S. Supreme Court rejected African American citizenship claims. The Dred Scott decision stated that the country's founders had viewed blacks as so inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This ruling, by declaring unconstitutional the Missouri Compromise 1820, through which Congress had limited the expansion of slavery into Western territories, ironically strengthened the anti-slavery movement, because it angered many whites who did not hold enslaved people. The inability of the country's political leaders to resolve that dispute fueled the successful presidential campaign of Abraham Lincoln, the candidate of the anti-slavery Republican Party. Lincoln's victory in turn prompted the southern slave states to secede and form the Confederate States of America in 1860-61. Although Lincoln did not initially seek to abolish slavery, his determination to punish the rebellious states and his increasing reliance on black soldiers in the Union Army prompted him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, to deprive the Confederacy of its enslaved property. After the American Civil War ended, Republican leaders cemented the Union victory by gaining the ratification of constitutional amendments to abolish slavery, 13th Amendment, and to protect the legal equality of formerly enslaved persons, 14th Amendment, and the voting rights of male ex-slaves, 15th Amendment. Despite those constitutional guarantees of rights, almost a century of civil rights agitation and litigation would be required to bring about consistent federal enforcement of those rights in the former Confederate states. Moreover, after federal military forces were removed from the South at the end of Reconstruction, white leaders in the region enacted new laws to strengthen the Jim Crow system of racial segregation and discrimination. In its Plessy v. Ferguson's decision, 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities for African Americans did not violate the 14th Amendment, ignoring evidence that the facilities for blacks were inferior to those intended for whites. The Southern system of white supremacy was accompanied by the expansion of European and American imperial control over non-white people in Africa and Asia, as well as in island countries of the Pacific and Caribbean regions. Like African Americans, most non-white people throughout the world were colonized or economically exploited and denied basic rights, such as the right to vote. With few exceptions, women of all races everywhere were also denied suffrage rights.